Warning: the following video contains discussions of the topics suicide and self-harm. Please do not proceed if such topics cause you undue distress. Hi everyone, welcome to Psychology of Wellness. It's Shui here. I apologize that I don't, exactly look human right now. I'm kind of having a bad hair day and I decided it was time to let my hair hang freely instead of pulling it back into a tight ponytail because, well, constantly doing that isn't good for it. Anyhow, regardless, I have a video that I just wanted to get in, and in this video I wanted to talk a little bit about mental health and mental illness as far as the meaning behind those terms, and I wanted to talk about some common misconceptions and replace those with facts. So first of all, before we get started, it would be good to define what mental health means. Now, what do you guys think the term mental health means? Most of you probably are going to say something along the lines of, well, mental health being the absence of mental illness, and you wouldn't be completely wrong, because after all, ideally, if you are to be healthy, you don't want to be ill in any way, right? But while you're on the right track when you say that, it's not completely right either, because think of it this way. You could hypothetically have an individual who's healthy in the sense that they are uh, they have well-functioning organ systems, they have good energy, they have a good appetite, they have a good sleep schedule, and everything else that's a measure of physical health, but they could be diabetic. It just so happens that maybe their diabetes is so well controlled that it doesn't really affect them in any negative way, so long as they stick to their prescribed, lifestyle or medication or whatever you have. So in that case, you wouldn't necessarily call them unhealthy, but you wouldn't call them. But diabetes is still diabetes. They still have that illness present. So similar idea with mental illness. A person could have manic depression, better known as bipolar disorder, or an anxiety disorder, but they could be really well functioning and their condition could be very well controlled. In that case, they still are mentally healthy, but they aren't necessarily free of mental illness. So moving on, we just defined what mental health means. Mental health is essentially an optimal level of thinking, feeling, and behaving that allows you to lead a normal lifestyle. So what do you think mental illness means? If you said condition that influences one's behavior, thought, and feelings in a negative way, such that it affects their life in a bad way, you're right on. So in both cases, those definitions I pulled off of online medical sites, namely MedicineNet and Mayo Clinic. But if you were to search it up in any other trustworthy resources such as textbooks and, well, professionals, you'd get pretty much the same thing. It might be worded a little differently, but you would end up getting overall the same thing. Anyhow, now that we have our terms defined, how this is going to work is I am going to say 10 statements, and you are going to tell me whether or not they are true or false. So they are statements pertaining to mental health, mental illness, and you are going to guess whether or not they are true or false. Now, if you want to participate in this challenge, then I encourage you to pause the video after I say each statement and then play it on, because I will be telling you the answer after I say each statement and explaining it. But if you just want to watch to the end and learn, then that's fine too. I'll leave it up to you. So, if we're ready, then let's get started. Statement number 1, true or false? Depression is the same as sadness. The correct answer here is false. Although sadness is probably the most common and stereotypical symptom of depression, sadness is an emotional state and depression is a psychological state. So, depression is actually a complex medical condition that affects you both physically and psychologically. In fact, if you were to take a look across cultures, in collectivist cultures like China and other Eastern Asian places, you would notice that people with depression are actually less likely to show sadness, but more likely to show physical symptoms like fatigue and appetite change. Versus westernized countries like North Americans, they are actually more likely to manifest the emotional symptoms, and granted they still show the physical symptoms, but they show the emotional symptoms most stereotypically. So, but overall in the end it's still depression, and although every person's depression is a little bit different, it's still defined as the same medical condition. So statement number 2, true or false? Mental illness can be heritable throughout family lineages. The correct answer is true. Although we usually think of heritable illnesses as things such as diabetes and cancer and heart disease, mental illnesses, although not 100% heritable, do show patterns of running in family lineages. So each mental illness is obviously different in terms of its heritability, but just about all mental illnesses do show some degree of it. Some which have more physiological basis, such as autism, probably run in families more readily than others, such as depression, which could be triggered by either biochemical factors or environmental factors, but they still have some component of it there. So statement number 3, true or false? Stress is a major factor in determining life expectancy. The correct answer is true. Although we don't always necessarily think about it, stress, particularly in the first world, can significantly decrease one's physical health and overall life expectancy, depending on how it affects them. So think of what are the leading causes of illness in North America. If you had said cancer and heart disease, then you're absolutely correct. And the reason why, besides the fact, well, one of the main reasons why, I should say, is simply due to stress. So, stress can cause, obviously, chronically elevated heart rate or blood pressure or whatever, which over time can affect your heart and your arteries and your circulation. So that's for heart disease. But another thing that stress can do is it causes elevated levels of cortisol, which is a stress hormone. And cortisol, its role is to help your body metabolize glucose more efficiently. However, what it can also do is it can strain your genetics. So cortisol has been shown to perhaps lead to genetic damage in your cells in some cases, which of course is a recipe for cancer. Now that's not to say that stress is necessarily a bad thing. It's there to help motivate us. It's just that there's a difference between a healthy level of stress and a pathological level of stress. And currently in North America and in a lot of other westernized nations, we are pretty much at the brink of it being chronically pathological. I mean, of course, there's also other factors to consider in cancer and heart disease, such as our diet, our exercise or lack of exercise, and not to mention the fact that we're just living longer than we used to overall. However, stress is definitely not a neglectable factor. So statement number 4, true or false? Mental illness is never life-threatening. The correct answer is false. Although mental illness itself may not necessarily claim someone's life, and even when it causes stress, it doesn't immediately have to claim someone's life, mental illness is actually a very high risk factor in death in young populations. And the reasons is because of suicide. So about 90% of suicide victims are actually have some form of mental illness. So that's according to the Canadian Mental Health Association. And suicide, according to them, is the second leading cause of death in young people. So yes, suicide is a behavior that the victim ultimately chooses. However, keep in mind that when they do choose to do so, they are likely in such a distraught state, and their thinking is so clouded, their behaviors are so maladaptive that it's probably not really them when they're in the same sense as when they're healthy, who's choosing that decision. Most people who commit suicide don't actually want to die necessarily. They are just on the brink of what we call ambivalence, which is the point between wanting to live versus wanting to die. So think of it like a teeter-totter or a seesaw, but ultimately just wanting to end the pain. So statement number 5, true or false? Self-harming is a gateway to suicide. The correct answer is false. Although people who self-harm, so doing things such as cutting or burning themselves, are probably more at risk of engaging in suicidal behaviors than other populations, the intention of self-harming is not suicide. The intention of self-harming is ultimately for an individual to end pain, so to end their emotional pain by directing it physically, or several other reasons. But ultimately, once again, they're not trying to necessarily put themselves in life-threatening danger, nor are they trying to, eventually commit suicide. It is simply a coping mechanism that just happens to be maladaptive, and those individuals, just in order to overcome it, just need lots of support. So statement number 6, true or false? Questioning someone whether they are or are not suicidal can make them become suicidal. The correct answer here is false. So this is actually a very common misconception, that if you observe someone who's struggling very heavily with mental illness or life stress or whatever, and you suspect they may be suicidal, asking them is the worst idea because it might put the idea in their mind. In reality, that's not really the case. In fact, many people who do commit suicide actually give off symptoms or signs that potentially could warn others. But the fact of the matter is, chances are if they answer yes to that question, they were already suicidal, and asking them and helping them find help and support can only help them instead of hurt them. So statement number 7, true or false? Giving someone advice during their period of distress can actually increase their distress rather than decrease. The correct answer is true. Although that's not necessarily always the case, and of course professionals such as doctors and psychologists give professional advice. If you are just a supportive listener to someone and you're not qualified to do things such as give them diagnoses and assessments and treatments, and you are just being a friend, giving someone advice can very much hurt them more than help them if you're not careful. The reason is because, regardless of how well intended your advice is, it can pass off as intrusive or condescending to the victim. So, if you think about it, all advice really is what the person giving the advice thinks that they would personally do in someone else's situation. But the keywords here are think, personally, in someone else's situation. Most people, as a general rule, most people who do give advice to others are, of course, not necessarily in that person's situation, so it's impossible for them to predict how they would personally behave if they were put in the same spotlight, because they're not emotionally stressed. So the best thing to do, actually, if you are listening to someone, is to just be there, to validate their feelings, and to let them know that they're heard. So, statement number 8, true or false? Poor parenting can lead to mental illness. And the correct answer is false. Well, okay. This one's actually a little bit tricky. Yes, poor parenting can trigger mental illness in some individuals, but poor parenting is not necessarily the sole cause of mental illness. So I guess when I say false, what I mean is false, not true in all circumstances. So a lot of parents think that if their child does end up developing a mental illness like depression or schizophrenia or bipolar, they take it on themselves, and because of that, they are embarrassed to, well, let their child seek help. And besides just being plain abusive and that type of behavior, the fact of the matter is, fact of the matter is, most of the times, poor parenting, if present, may just be one factor. And again, it's not the cause of their depression or their anxiety or whatever. Now, I'm not denying that those who grew up in abusive families, such as, let's say, with alcoholic parents, in that case, maybe can cause them a mental illness. But the fact of the matter is, poor parenting is not the sole cause of mental illness, and if a child comes forth to a parent that they do have a mental health struggle, parents shouldn't automatically assume that. And they definitely shouldn't be too ashamed to get the child help, because hiding from a problem will only make it worse, not better. So statement number 9, true or false? Mentally ill individuals are weak-willed. The correct answer here is false. So this is actually a very common belief. Mental illness is only appearing in weak-willed individuals. And this is one of those things that's an unfortunate remnant of old school thinking. Although, yes, some individuals who have less, let's say, like less adaptive coping strategies are maybe more at risk of developing mental illness, but it's not necessary. Mental illness says nothing about the individual's strength. In fact, many mentally ill individuals are actually better at coping with stress and depression and emotions than the average individual, just because they've had so much practice. They practice that out of need. Fact of the matter is, mental illness can develop because of any combination of reasons, and being weak-willed is often not one of them. So most people who are mentally ill are just individuals, are just normal individuals who happen to have an illness. That's all it is. So statement number 10, true or false? It's easy to recognize someone who has a mental illness because they behave and think and feel in ways that are so different than other individuals. The correct answer here is false. So this one unfortunately comes from the media portrayal of the schizophrenic individual, the one who just got taken off the street because he was behaving in bizarre ways and locked up in the hospital. But the fact of the matter is that those individuals represent probably less than 1% of all who are mentally ill. Although, yes, in extreme cases, some individuals who have mental illnesses can behave in those ways, it's not at all a fair representation of everyone. And especially considering mental illness can range from anything from depression to schizophrenia to whatever. it's really impossible to tell who has a mental illness and who doesn't, because some individuals with mental illnesses are probably just as functional and even more functional than those who don't have one. And in fact, 1 in 5 individuals in Canada will develop a mental illness at some point in their lifetimes. So that's 20% of the Canadian population, which, by the way, is bigger than the entire population of Norway. And yes, Norway is a very small country, and Canada has overall way bigger of a population than they do. However, if you're Canadian and you just think, walking down the street, approximately 1 out of every 5 individuals I see struggles with some form of mental illness, well, that certainly doesn't even fit that definition of it's easy to recognize someone with mental illness, does it? Because I can tell you personally, walking down the street encountering someone who's behaving in those bizarre ways that we portray people in the media, that's a very rare occurrence for me. In fact, I don't even remember the last time that I happened to run into someone like that. And if I did, I could tell that it was probably they were probably under substance influence instead of necessarily being mentally ill. So there you have it. Those are 10 statements that are relevant to mental health and mental illness, and well, the answer is as to whether or not they are true or false. So, I mean, I hope you guys have learned something from this experience, and even if you didn't, I hope you find this video to be informative. And in upcoming videos, I'm going to discuss more in depth about mental illnesses, especially anxiety, and you guys are going to understand why as we go on. But until then, I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I will see you in the next video. Alright, well, have a good one, everybody.